Yes, hi, I'm Sarah Stevens. I'm an undergraduate at UNCW studying environmental science. I'm also part of the Honors College, so I had the opportunity to do an honors research project as a part of my undergraduate degree. And I have a geospatial minor, so I'm working with Dr. Joanne Halls under the EOS department to put together this project. And yeah, I would like to shout out to the West Virginia DNR. They're the ones who came to us. Their endangered species biologist, Alex Silvis, reached out after UNCW had connected to do some genetics, and he said, I really need a geospatial project done on the same species, and asked if I would be willing to take that on. So grateful for him for reaching out about this project. Also, I want to shout out my committee members. Dr. Halls is my primary advisor, and then I have Dr. Urbanik with the environmental sciences at UNCW as a committee member. I have Dr. Stephanie Kamel with the biology department as a committee member, and then Alex Silvis is also on my committee. Yeah. So just to briefly go over what we're going to touch on today, a little discussion about wildlife conservation and GIS, and then we're going to move into my project and talk a bit about the species that we were working on and current management, and then we're going to move into some methodology, go over traditional approaches to answering the questions we're trying to answer, our GIS approach, then some preliminary results, and then a little bit of a discussion. I do want to outline our project objectives. Basically, West Virginia DNR came to us and they said, we really want to understand where in the forest that we're trying to manage is primary habitat for the species and where is primary connectivity happening for the species. Are they still connected? Because we have a lot of occurrence data because we've been monitoring for a long time. We don't really understand how it all relates to each other. So we were making generative informative maps and then also doing some looking at how connectivity will change temporally over the next decades and into 2050 and 2100. But to start off, we're going to go into wildlife conservation and GIS. GIS has been around for a bit now, but I feel like I'm hearing more and more commonly that it is a huge aspect of wildlife conservation. It's been used throughout the world to understand how animals interact with their habitats and how we can better, as people, work to manage habitats and interact with our wildlife. And I also see that it's increasingly common to have desired qualifications related to GIS on even entry-level biologist positions that I'm looking at, which is interesting. A lot of times people say that outdoors and computer jobs don't go together, but in this case, it's becoming more and more intermixed. GIS is obviously a critical tool for understanding connectivity and movement in the state of North Carolina that has looked a variety of ways. It can be super narrowly focused, such as modeling various habitats for golden-winged warblers in North Carolina. That was a study done by Duke with Brown et al., and I have some images from that. Or it can be more general, looking at what lands would be best to help connectivity and working with private landowners to acquire those lands or put them into trusts to be able to help species. GIS is also very helpful when it comes to amphibians specifically, because amphibians have different habitat needs throughout their life. They have aquatic phases and terrestrial phases. It's a really great way to understand how they're interacting with the habitat, and it's not as invasive as going out and doing ground surveys. You can use drones and LiDAR and all sorts of things to better understand the habitat you're looking at. And amphibians also are a vertebrate group that is declining faster than any other vertebrate group. We're losing a lot of species in that sect, so super important for conservation. To go a little bit more into my project, we are working with Plephodon nettingii, which is the cheap mountain salamander. They're already a spatially interesting species because they're kind of only on sky islands is what it's called. They're high elevation, range restricted, and they occur at above 2,500 feet normally. They're also predominantly in the Appalachian Mountains of West Virginia. And their habitat is predominantly mature red spruce canopy, and then that is able to create a nice mossy, humid environment at these higher elevations and slightly cooler temps than you'd see in the valleys. And also rocky outcropping is really important for them, and that's an artifact of previous things that happened, such as clear cutting and forest fires that kind of bottlenecked them to be associated with rocky outcrops. Not a whole lot is known about their home range, but similar species have pretty small home ranges, only about 15 meters squared throughout their life, and these guys are only like 5 centimeters themselves. So to look at species threats, there was a lot of habitat loss predicted due to climate change. This is because as this area warms, they can't go any higher on the mountain, and that is going to push them out of the range they're already at. Also, a lot of the red spruce is going to die out due to climate change because it's not able to deal with those hotter temperatures. And then annual precipitation is also likely to change in this area with climate models. So that will definitely affect this species. There's also been intense habitat fragmentation, as I talked about. There was clear cutting and forest fires. There's also been installation of utility lines, such as oil and gas lines, electrical lines, and any break in the canopy is really hard for these guys to traverse, as well as roads. Any sort of roads that have been put in, that also produces a canopy gap, and it's difficult for these guys to cross. They're just gonna decide not to go across that. Anthropogenic impacts, obviously utility lines and roads, but also recreation. Hiking trails have been known to impact just degrade their habitat. Interestingly enough, people who go out and camp and they build fire rings to have a fire in, these guys think that's a great place to hang out and sleep, and then when someone lights a fire in that illegal fire ring, they die. But lastly, competition with other species, as I talked about, suitability for other species that are more general salamanders, such as Plethodon cinereus, the redback salamander. They're expanding up further in elevation on the mountains and moving into these guys' area. It's been speculated that they have actually started hybridizing with P. whirlii salamanders, so not great. It's also a complex issue. I wanted to get into this a little bit before we got into the methods. Since it is on national forest land, there's a lot of entities working together to try and manage this species. There's the West Virginia DNR, there's the US Forest Service, there's private landowners, all sorts of things. And also, this area is being used for a lot of different needs, such as timber production, recreation mandates. There's other species that they have to manage habitat for, and sometimes those species have conflicting habitat needs. So the cerulean warbler is in this area, and those actually need thinned forest, and these guys the salamanders need really dense forest. It's also just a really extensive area. It spans almost 100 miles north to south, and for managers to understand which parts of that are important for the salamander specifically will be really helpful. So that's why we're making these informative generative maps. Also, just a heads up, a lot of this data is sensitive because people go out and take these salamanders out of the wild or mess with habitat areas, so I have been limited on what I can show you guys on maps, so I apologize. A lot of them in the future will not have scale bars or north arrows or anything. Second reason it's a complex issue, these are a federally threatened species, and in their action recovery plan, there's a lot of language about populations. They have not been able to come to a consensus on what a biological population is, which is why we're looking at these occurrence polygons and trying to figure out how related they really are. There's also a relative lack of research. These guys have been monitored for a really long time. As you can see, their recovery plan was published in 1991. So we have decades of data on them about occurrences and habitat types and things like that. But not a lot of in-depth research has been done. It's just been a lot of monitoring up until now. And again, little is known about the Sheep Mountain salamander's home range. This is also due to their affinity for rocky outcroppings. They like to move subterraneously, so it's really difficult to track an animal and understand where they're going if they're underground. Okay, moving into some methodology. Traditional methods for understanding how related different disjunct groups are can include genomic sequencing or other genetic work. This is really expensive and invasive. You have to go out, you have to take tail clips of this species, send it off to a lab, get it sequenced, get it back, understand the data. The other approach is to do network analysis using circuit theory to understand gene flow movement, and that can require an in-depth knowledge in coding, and it can be very time-consuming. It also, you have to basically build up a model for each individual species and understand their habitat requirements and everything like that. One such package that makes it a little bit easier is CircuitScape that has been known to be used for this type of network analysis. Getting into our methods, when we got this project, they were asking us to find a way that was more accessible for managers to access, so we want to do everything in Esri Arc Pro using the traditional tools that are already part of Esri Arc Pro, such as least cost corridors and optimal paths. I'll get into this workflow a little bit more later, but I just wanted to point out there is a unique generational connectivity consideration for the species. Because they're so small, we're not trying to say that they're traversing these optimal paths, which normally when you run an optimal path or a least cost corridor, you could have one individual of your species going that entire length. They could move through habitat that is slightly less suitable for the species. With these guys, we're trying to find connections of cells that are suitable enough to support an individual or population for its entirety of its life. This approach, generally, we're trying to make it more accessible, less costly, and less invasive because we can use a lot of data that isn't related to going out into the field and poking and prodding these animals. To go a little bit into the data we were using, we got lovely suitability models from a PhD candidate, Lacey Rucker, who is under Dr. Brown at the West Virginia University. She was able to make current suitability models that focused on data from 2013 to 2017, and then also future suitability models that were 2 different years, 2050 and 2100, under 2 different greenhouse gas emissions, so medium and high. And here's an example. That's the current suitability. It looks pretty good. This green area is where it's really great for the salamanders. And then if you look at just 2050 under medium emissions, which is the least extreme scenario, you see a lot more red and a lot less green. So not looking too great. But her modeling took into account multiple variables, and they found the ones that were most predictive of good habitat for the species. Statistically, they did bootstrapping and everything. We also were given occurrence data from the West Virginia DNR. We got point data, which was roughly 1,800 points and spanned from 1976 to 2024. And then we also got polygon data of occurrence areas, and that was 53 polygons, and that was actually digitized from field notes that people had taken. So the accuracy was a little bit in question. They wanted us to look at it and compare it to the point data. As you can see here, you can see the little boxes up here. That's this box down here. And you can see the occurrence polygons do not exactly line up with our occurrence points. So that was something we were interested in looking at in this project as well. Lastly, data we used included barriers and landforms. We got some all routes roads from the West Virginia Division of Highways. We also used some national forest roads, and we weighted those based on how hard it was for a salamander to traverse. So if it was just a gravel road like seen here, then it's a little bit easier for them. If also closed canopy above, easier for them. If it was, a 4-lane highway that's salted and treated and the ground was compacted to create it, then it's weighted at a higher level. And then also utility lines, pipeline construction, and electrical transmission lines. And then we also pulled in some landform data just to cover that affinity for rocky outcropping, and that was actually using the USGS Geographic Name Information System, which just gave us a point to look at, mountain or peaks, ridges, and anything that was related to rocky outcrops. So to quickly look at the occurrence data, we found that, also I want to point out that Lacey Rucker's models were trained with a smaller data set than we had, so we were expanding on this by looking at how well the models lined up with the occurrence data set we had. And it seemed like right around 0.95 out of 1, so 95% suitable was the median score. The lowest was 0.72, excluding outliers. And then I also was concerned that since we had data from the 1970s, that they might be skewing these numbers up here, and that there might be areas that are now lower suitability than what they used to be. So we took a look at that and actually saw that all of the points that were collected in like the 1970s, 1980s are still pretty high suitability. There's one outlier there, but it was actually getting down into the 2010s that we saw much lower suitability, and I think that's just because we started surveying more heavily for this species. Okay, get into some of the methods. To get our outputs, I basically took a suitability raster and I inverted it to create a cost raster. So anything that's really good suitability is a really low cost for this species. And then I fed that into the distance accumulation tool, and then I output least cost corridor and optimal paths. There's some small examples there. And I did optimal paths between all the polygons and then least cost corridors between neighboring polygons. I was also able to do a network analysis on the points and run paths from all of those. And then we looked at we're working on looking at barrier intersections and also doing some point clustering. So once we got our optimal paths and least cost corridors, we took them and we looked at the coincidence of paths. We also looked at the biological significance or soundness of paths. That meant, did it run through an area that was lower than the lowest suitability for the species, and then it was excluded from the data set, basically. And then, of course, we're working on looking at the comparison of current to future suitability and connectivity. How much time? Okay. So also, a side note to this is the fact that we had such a discrepancy between the polygons and the points. We wanted to try and do a multivariate clustering analysis using the suitability score on the point, the nearest rocky landform, and the proximity to each other, obviously. We haven't been able to get this to quite give sound outputs yet, but I am working to tweak it. But that will better help managers maybe redraw those polygons or look at them a little more critically. So, some results. Current connectivity overview. Preliminary analysis indicates greater connectivity in suitable areas. That makes sense. We also were able to identify 5 current connections between disjunct occurrence polygons. I wasn't supposed to put those on the map, but there's some down in this area, there's some up in this area, and there's like 1 or 2 in this area. And then 3 candidate areas for restoration of connectivity, and this is a big example of that here. We have 2 very large occurrence polygons, and not too much land in between them, so we could hypothetically the managers could work to restore that area. Here's an example of an area that has a current connection, so this is really high suitability area here. These are disjunct occurrence polygons. Those are the optimal paths running through them. You see there's a really large coincidence of paths there, and then the least cost corridor is in that grayscale behind it. It was interesting, we did not include this polygon in the least cost corridor analysis, and it showed that paths running from this polygon to this polygon actually run into this polygon, which makes sense. That's great. Some general future stats. It's not looking too great. We're seeing a huge decrease in suitable habitat just from 2020 to 2050 under the medium emissions. You can see all this green area is good habitat, and then it gets really, really sparse. There's a little bit up here and a little bit down here. We're dropping by about 74%. All the corridor analysis I ran at a median cost related to the optimal paths, and they all closed. But if we look at suitability, which we'll in a little bit, the corridors dropped by about 45 to 60%, which was hard to see. There are 3 mountaintops that maintain connectivity based on this 2050 modeling. So we're going to present that to managers and just let them know where it'd be most likely that connectivity would stay. Here's an example of a current corridor. You can see there's a strong, this green is all really good suitable habitat. It's above the threshold. And you can see that they all coincide, all those optimal paths. And also the point and polygon data is pretty consistent here. I don't know if hopefully you can see the points. But then if we look at the same polygon in the 2050 medium emissions, you see it get a lot patchier. So this is the informative maps we're generating for the West Virginia DNR, just to tell them, hey, hopefully if you put restoration in this area, possibly plant more red spruce, you can maintain this connection, or possibly look at routing this connection up like that, so that you're not fighting a losing war against climate change, basically. Here's a candidate corridor example. You can see currently, this is 2020. There is good habitat here. There's a little break, though, before this occurrence polygon, and to get to these points, it's not as good. So it's slightly less contiguous. So this is something that initially we'd be like, oh, maybe this can be restored. However, we're going to look at the same polygon, which I know looks a little different here, but this is the least cost corridor between those same 2 polygons currently, which has a pretty good suitability score. It's like 0.82. This is it in 2050. It drops a lot, down to about 0.46. So it's decreased by about 45%, and it's no longer viable for p-netting eye populations. So we're just going to present this information to managers and see what they want to do, and if they do want to try to maintain connectivity here, or if this is a losing battle for them, and they're going to opt to maybe not focus here and focus on another area of the range. And then some discussion. So just looking at our approach that we're using, there's obviously needs to be further research to assess the reliability of these methods. There has been a couple papers on it already, but it's always good to have a bigger data set, maybe something that already has that genomic study done, and we really strongly know the genetic connectivity of the area, and then backtrack and do this approach and see how well it compares. Benefits to this approach, it's more accessible to managers. I know that the West Virginia DNR has a GIS department. Drawbacks, it's not as customizable. A lot of times when I was running these tools, I was like, man, I really want to weight this a little bit differently, but I cannot do that because I am not a whiz at coding yet. As for the management with this project, looking at the species specifics, intense management is needed. Restoration should be focused on the most robust connections, which is why we're making these maps for them. Planting of red spruce should be considered to increase resiliency. I would even say assisted migration of red spruce varieties from the Carolinas should be considered, because the West Virginia variety of red spruce is not as climate resilient. Right now, it's hard to for them to manage these areas because of the whole what is a population, how many stable populations do we have, how much take are we allowed to have, which is like incidental loss of an individual to species. So they're really scared to plant trees because it disrupts the ground and it could impact these salamander populations. But trees take time to grow, and they need to be planted now if we're going to see positive effects in 2050 and possibly negate the negative effects we're seeing from climate change in 2050. As for next steps for this project, finishing statistical analyses, I would love to compare the results of the Esri tools with the toolbox that CircuitScape actually made. So that was something I mentioned earlier. It's used a lot for network analysis. And they made a toolbox that you can just plug into Esri and use their corridor tools. And I really want to see if there's any differences between those two. And then also, I would love to explore visual aids and using Esri Enterprise to make some like linkage maps to show the strength of different disjunct polygons. But yeah, here are some of my references. And I think that's about time. So thank you, guys. Yes.
What was your most challenging aspect of your project?
Thank you.
What did you find challenging?
Yes. So I was asked what the most challenging aspect of my project was, or what I found the most challenging. Probably balancing a really large data set. We started out running on the polygons, and then we showed the results in the fall to the West Virginia DNR, and they said, wow, this looks really good. We would love for you to do this on almost 1,800 points. And I wasn't as knowledgeable in regards to Esri and ArcGIS yet, and the models I had built for the polygons were not working for the points. So I spent a couple months just trying to run things that I was just running around circles for a little bit. But that was probably the most challenging, was using a very large data set for part of the project. Yeah. Yeah.
I'm sorry, I came in late. I apologize.
Here.
I didn't hear. Where did you gather most of your data from?
Yes, so a lot of it was provided by the West Virginia DNR. They had a huge database on occurrences. A lot of that came from field notes from Tom Pauly, who has been studying the species since the 1970s, and that's the occurrence data. So we were working really closely with them to collect it. I can go back to the slide I was talking about. Oh yeah, this is the most important data, and that was from Lacey Rucker and her work under Dr. Brown at West Virginia University. They have a paper in press that's on my references slide that I can share with you after if you would like. But their suitability modeling was key to this project. This could not be done without this. Yeah, and then a lot of our other data sets were just like publicly available or stored on the West Virginia DNR. Did that answer?
I guess I have a question on this is a great work, but I was wondering, can this be done for any animal or creature, or only like salamanders? Is there any key characteristic that has to be there?
That's a really good question. So I was asked if this can be done with any species or if it's specific to salamanders. Yes, this can be done with any species. You just need a cost raster, which is what we used this suitability raster as, and then you need to know where they've occurred. And then you can plug that into the tools and work from there. You can customize it a little bit more than that, but that's the basics. For other larger animals, they're usually traversing these paths, so it gets a little more messy because your threshold for like what is optimal for them to move through changes, because a wolf might be able to run across the highway versus the salamander can't live on a highway.
All right, thank you.
Yeah. Awesome. Wait, one more.
Have you seen any alternatives to corridors? I noticed out there that they have these the highways.
That is a great question. Thank you for asking. I was asked if there are alternatives to corridors and specifically structures that can go under or over roads. They are doing research in the Canaan Valley in West Virginia under the U.S. Fish and Wildlife on connections for the species underneath not only hiking paths but also roads, seeing if they'll use culverts to travel under. So they're trying to do some small-scale research. But I haven't heard anything back about what data they've collected in regard to that project. But thanks, yeah. So yes, there are. Cool.